Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Today we're going to be in conversation about the oldest democracy that we have a good accounting of. That's ancient Greece, roughly between the years of 500 and 300 BCE. We're also talking about how its court systems worked and the threats that it faced. My guest for this conversation is Daniela Cammack. Daniela Cammack is assistant professor at UC Berkeley. Her research and teaching focus on the history of democracy and constitutionalism, and she's currently working on a book about ancient Greek democracy. Daniela Cammack, it is my very good pleasure to welcome you to this program.
Thank you so much. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for
these conversations are always my favorite. I suspect that many people out there think that, and I used to think this too, that democracy and a democratic form of government was more of a modern kind of government, maybe something that even began with the United States. But that's not true at all. Democracy is very old.
It's very, very old. Yeah, the term demos actually first appears in the Mycenaean Bronze Age on the tablets that we have in Linear B, not written in the kind of alphabet that we recognize. But then we find it again in the Archaic and the Classical Greek eras, and by the middle of the Classical era, it's twinned with the ending kratia, democratia, rule by the demos, kind of the dominance of the demos, and it's known as a political form, and it's very common. It was very common throughout the ancient Greek world. We mostly think about Athens, but actually there were loads of different democracies. There's a wonderful book by a guy called Eric Robinson, and he's shown that in the Classical era there are probably 56 other democratiae that were called democratiae, and probably many others that had aspects of the institutions of democracy.
Is Athens the oldest?
No, I don't believe so. No, it's hard to say because we don't have as much evidence as we'd want to. But in the Archaic period, there are at least another 17 or 18 communities that have a good claim to fit the bill of what would have been called democratia. We just don't have the attestation of the word until kind of the middle of the Classical era. About kind of 430, we have the first appearance in Herodotus. He uses the term and the verbs associated with it. But we know that there were other communities earlier than that had very similar political forms. So basically, the key political form is the assembly. So places that had not just an open meeting or kind of an open gathering, a mass assembly, but also where that mass assembly actually had kind of prevailing political power. That's the definition of democratia that kind of seems to have made most sense to the ancient Greeks, and it's the one that I try to respect.
I've always got the sense, and again, I'm a layperson to this, but interested, that Greek democracy, and I guess we'll focus on Athenian democracy, though I'm happy to go anywhere else you want to go, that it came out of class struggle. And what I mean by that is that there was a moment in Athens in which inequality was extreme. And in fact, a lot of people were even in debt slavery. And it was fueling a crisis, that one that we might even understand with inequality. And that Athens brought in this man by the name of Solon to come up with these sort of reforms to make everyone happy as you possibly can, to keep things steady again. And that Solon himself didn't actually create democracy, but it would be the steps towards reforming a system that would become democratic down the line. So I guess my question here is, do you think that's accurate? Does democracy come out of a class struggle?
Yeah, well, no, definitely. There's lots to that picture. So yeah, we know that there was an era of what the Greeks called stasis, basically civil war, civil conflict. And Solon was brought in to calm this stasis, this conflict between the elites, the nobles, the gnourimoi is in Greek, and the demos, also called the plethos, the kind of the mass or the multitude, also called hoi polloi, the many. And he kind of tried to be a good negotiator or a good arbitrator. He tried to give things to both sides. And one thing that he did was he said all the ordinary people, all basically the working classes, would have the right from thenceforth to attend assemblies and also act as judges, have some kind of judicial role. Those are the two kind of mass arenas in ancient politics. And yeah, he gave ordinary people those rights. There was a lot of power held by like the kind of different councils. It's not entirely clear, like, that the assembly and the courts were calling the shots. I mean, it's pretty clear that they weren't for quite a long time. But from the Solonic era, it seems that there was a kind of an institutional home for ordinary people to take part in politics. That rapidly disappeared under the era of tyranny that immediately followed Solon. But then there was another era kind of civil strife and conflict. A bit later, the tyrants were deposed, and Cleisthenes ended up being the kind of champion of the people. He was an aristocrat. I mean, he was a member of the elite, but he ended up kind of being more or less victorious in the civil war because he managed to enlist the demos, the ordinary people, on his side. And then that was around about 508 BC. And that's really when the ancient Greeks seem to date the beginning of Demokratia proper too. So they said that Solon had given kind of the roots or the seeds, in some sense, of the democratic system. But Herodotus, who's the earliest historian that we have, he's kind of confident in dating the beginning of Demokratia in Athens to the era of Cleisthenes, when the assembly kind of came back into the foreground as the main decision maker in the political system, and the elite councils were basically disbanded or downgraded, and there was instead a more popular council which was operated really like just through the use of a lottery. It was a random selection from all the different districts of Athens, and that took the job of kind of steering committee for the Athenians. So they had the heart of the system was the mass assembly, and then they had this the council that was not really a decision-making council. And as time went on, it had even less and less power. That all the power ended up being shared between the mass assembly and the mass courts, but in both cases with ordinary citizens being the ones in the driving seat.
And that's important, citizens being in the driver's seat. And that is what's significant about ancient Athenian democracy, is that regardless of wealth, maybe at its height, regardless of wealth, all citizens, and citizens is a limited term as it's always been and still is, but this time mainly talking about males here from Athens, but all males who are citizens were able to freely participate in the political process.
Yeah, so this is the amazing historical anomaly of ancient Greek democracies. They were very serious about working class males being able to participate politically. And of course, like, today most people look at the franchise in Athens and elsewhere in that time, and they think, oh, women couldn't vote, and oh, they had slaves, and the foreigners couldn't vote either. If they didn't have citizenship, they weren't naturalized. But to the Greeks, all that was so normal, and that was true of every community all around the Mediterranean, and it's obviously been true of most historical communities up to the present. But what was really significant was they not just allowed poor men to take part in politics, they ended up funding it. So from the middle of the 5th century, they introduced a stipend for judges, so that ordinary working men could take a day. Trials never lasted more than a day. They could take a day and they could act as a judge in the courts as one of many. So the judicial panels were a minimum of 500. It could be 1,000 or 1,500. But they were empowered. They were attracted to go to the courts and do that work because they were paid. And the three obols, just to give a sense of what that was, it was about a kind of an ordinary working man's day wage if he was a laborer. Of course, most weren't exactly. Most of them were kind of semi-independent, at least, like peasants, smallholders. They had some land, but there were many artisans and so on as well. But another comparison would be with how much they were paid to row in the fleet. So rowers in the Athenian navy also got 3 obols a day. And they didn't introduce payment for the assembly until quite a lot later, until sometime in the 390s, so about 60 years later. But then they introduced it first at the rate of 1 obol, and then 2 obols, and then 3 obols. And then by the end of the period when Aristotle was writing, so around about 340, 330, by then it had reached 6 obols a day for one of the kind of regular meetings of the political month. They had 4 meetings every 40 days, or every 36 days, let's be precise. But it was 9 obols for the most important, what they called the sovereign meeting, the most significant meeting of the political month, when they held votes of confidence in all the office holders, when they invited impeachments, and when they discussed the kind of defense of the realm and the grain supply. That was when they gave people the most money. They gave them 9 obols to attend a meeting that actually only lasted a morning. So they really took this very seriously. They really wanted to bring ordinary people into politics and not necessarily hear them speak, because most people would not have been comfortable giving a speech to 6,000 or 8,000 people. By the end of the period, it could have been closer. It was closer to 13,000 or even 20,000 people were standing up. So these were huge audiences. So they weren't anticipating that all these ordinary working men would be standing up and being an orator.
Yeah.
What they were assuming was there'd be a few people giving speeches, and the ordinary citizens would just be there en masse to vote. So it was their voting power that was really significant, and nothing happened in Athens without a vote of approval, or without a veto from the assembly.
And this is a direct democracy, very different from our representational democracy. You didn't have representatives and senators. You did have people in positions, but I think that's something that's important to think about when it comes to Greek democracy is you didn't. Most people didn't participate through an election. You were picked by lot, like almost like jury duty in the modern day.
Yeah. So there's a few different things going on there. So yeah, one thing is, yes, in some of the institutions they were picked by lot. So in the council, absolutely, they're chosen by lot, but it's from volunteers. So you had to put yourself forward to enter the lottery, and then they would choose 2 people for each district, or rather, actually, it was all done in proportion to the size of the district population size. So that was actually a representational element. For spots on the council, the largest districts or the largest villages would send the most people, but there would be 2 people for each spot, one kind of chosen and one alternate in case the first person got sick or died or, couldn't do it for some reason. And that was done by lottery. Equally, jury duty or the judicial role, that was also done by a lot. But again, it's from people who turned up at the courts in the morning. You had to just show up in order to be, included in the lottery. It wasn't like modern jury duty where your name is drawn from a long, a list of residents, or from like a census. It was nothing like that. It was all done from volunteers. The assembly, though, was different. It was not chosen by lottery. The assembly was just an open meeting. So the word ecclesia, which means meeting, it comes from the verb ekkaleo, call out. So they just had a general call for the assembly, and you would just turn up. So it was whoever arrived, whoever got in. And lots of people complained, lots of anti-democrats, and mostly, many of the philosophers that were writing at the time, they complained that people were just turning up for the money. And it seems like the Athenian Democrats were okay with that. In terms of it being direct versus representative, I mean, yes, it was in the sense that most people think of the contrast between direct and representative democracy. It's absolutely true that people that were making decisions in the ancient Greek system were not there because they'd been elected. They were ordinary people who were there, as I said, either because they just showed up, or because they'd been chosen after having offered themselves as volunteers. They'd been chosen through a lottery. But it's not true that there weren't, well, first of all, it's not true that there weren't elections in this context. So they did elect people. They elected generals. All their military commanders were elected. And so they had the elections in the assembly. People had to stand, and they had to get the most votes in the way that we recognize. Equally, the treasurer in Athens was elected, and a few other positions, kind of basically important positions where they thought that you needed some basic level of competence, particularly if people's lives were at stake. They were very comfortable electing people in those conditions. Also, though, there's another dimension to representation in the Athenian system, which is that I think sometimes today people mistake when they think about direct democracy. They think this means that kind of, oh, everybody's involved in politics all the time, and like how exhausting and how much time this must take. The Athenians did a lot on rotation. So it was never the case that people were expected to go to every assembly meeting. Sometimes modern scholars talk as though citizens had a duty of attending and a duty of volunteering. And I've not found any evidence in any of the ancient sources that talk about it in that way. They had incentives in place, mainly the stipend, to encourage people to go, but you didn't have to go. And, the assembly in the middle of the classical period, say after the war with Sparta, around about 400, probably had a capacity of about 6,000 to 8,000 people. And there were probably about 30,000 adult male citizens that were eligible to go. And so that is a big chunk. It's a significant chunk. But they did seem to think that the people who were acting politically at any one time were representing all the other people that weren't there. So they just had a different mode of representation, is how I've been thinking about it. They had a form of representation where they thought that the part would speak for the whole. We have to think of representation as we elect somebody who will speak for us kind of on an ongoing basis. We elect somebody to be essentially different from us, to join a chamber, join a legislative assembly, and then to have this ongoing role where they're the decision maker and we just have to hope that they make the right decisions, or the ones that we like. And the Greek democracies didn't do that. They instead had people kind of switching in and out all the time. And what they thought made a good representative seems to have been that the representative was sufficiently like them in all relevant respects. So that includes being undistinguished. They liked it if ordinary undistinguished people were given the opportunity to make decisions on behalf of other ordinary undistinguished people. And they were very, very conscious of the difference that rapidly grew between anybody who was elected into a position of authority and given some real significance. They were very conscious that made a gulf open up between them and the ordinary citizens. And they accepted that they needed some of those people. So they needed these generals. They needed people to be significant politicians. They needed excellent orators, people with rhetorical skills, not just to make speeches in the assembly, but also to act as ambassadors. So they relied on the kind of talents of some of the political elite. But they were also super wary, because they recognized that gave those people, if not necessarily political power, because the power still lay with the mass assemblies and the courts, it nonetheless gave them huge political influence. And they worried a lot about how to control that influence and how to kind of keep it on a leash, if you like, or keep it working for the greater good, for the public good. And not have these people who clearly were, to some extent, attracted by the celebrity, the honor that went with being significant politically. They wanted them to do those significant, prominent jobs. They needed their skills and their talents and their commitment and their ambition. But then they also recognized that you need to build in systems of discipline and control in order to stop those political leaders ruling over ordinary people.
Tell me about the oligarchy then, and how was the oligarchy able to influence its to use the system to influence the outcomes, and what do we get?
So wait, so the oligarchy. So there were two interludes of oligarchical rule in Athens. There were two coups. So the elite was not happy. I mean, as you can imagine, the political elite is never happy to be under the thumb of mass bodies of ordinary people. So twice in Athens towards the end of the 5th century there were coups, proper conspiracies led by politicians who had been believed to be committed Democrats. It was a horrible shock for the Athenians. The first was in 411 and the second was in 404. And in the 411 one especially, it turned out that actually a lot of the generals that had been democratically elected were not Democrats at all. They were closet oligarchs, and they conspired to overthrow the democracy. And there was a period of some violence, and it was an unstable period. It actually only lasted a few months. Rapidly, very, very rapidly, by modern standards, the demos kind of reasserted control. A few of the generals were executed, the ones who'd been involved in this plot. A significant, not exactly orator, but kind of behind-the-scenes political fixer called Antiphon was also tried and executed. But then the same thing happened again in 404. After Athens had lost the ongoing war against Sparta, the Peloponnesian War had gone on for about 30 years, and Athens finally lost. And in the aftermath of that, 30 men were elected, 30 prominent men were elected to basically consider what the new political system should be for the Athenians, how they could reconstruct themselves after this defeat. And they were really, they were all kind of Spartan sympathizers. I mean, this was Athens as a defeated community. And those 30 men were later known as the 30 tyrants. They kind of started off looking fairly benign, but it seems like rapidly they instigated kind of a proper military coup. They killed 1,500 democratic citizens, and then the demos was put on the defensive. They were based at Piraeus, at the harbour town, and they had a proper civil war for about 8 months. But the demos won. So the demos, together with lots of foreigners and lots of slaves, also fighting with the demos, with the ordinary people, they defeated the oligarchs. in the very traditional classic fashion of just, beating them in war. And it was accepted thereafter that really gave them the right, as the military victors, it gave them the right to have political authority. There's a very interesting dimension to ancient Greek politics whereby they were very comfortable with thinking that it's not exactly might makes right. It was more like, if you're the winner, there is a certain there's a certain authority that comes with military victory that was actually accepted. And so at that point, even the oligarchs accepted that, okay, the demos achieved this victory under its own steam, with its own agency, and they won fair and square, we lost. And then the question was really, how was the demos to try and sew up the political system so that they didn't suffer from these elite-led coups again? And the next 80 years were actually very successful for democracy. Ultimately, I mean, at the end of the period, the rise of Macedon just put paid to all independent ancient Greek city-states. So there was still a measure of what kind of looked like democracy, and the assemblies met even under Macedonian kind of imperial rule. But it was on a much smaller franchise, and the jury courts, the democratic jury courts, were closed and didn't reopen. But for about 80 years, between the second oligarchical coup and the ultimate takeover by the Macedonians, the Athenians knitted together a really impressive system whereby they actually managed to have a political elite that was influential, important, gifted in many ways, both kind of militarily, like as generals, but also as speakers. And yet they were disciplined by the masses in the assemblies and courts in a really effective way.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation about ancient Athenian democracy. Our guest is Daniela Cammack. Daniela Cammack is assistant professor at UC Berkeley. Her research and teaching focuses on the history of democracy and constitutionalism. She's currently working on a book about ancient Greek democracy. Talk to me about the crises that democracy faced. Obviously, there were the coups that you already outlined. You mentioned a word earlier that I think is important, stasis or stasis. And I think of that word, and this isn't exactly how it's used, but I think of that word as meaning stuck. We're sort of stuck in a moment that we can't get out of. And it feels like that's what we're experiencing now in our own political system. Tell me, is this idea of stasis, and you can expand on what it really means, but is this something that we continue to find throughout the history of Athenian democracy?
Yes. I mean, so stasis, actually, yeah, you're right. Thinking of it as meaning stuck is a nice way to put it. It comes from the verb to stand. It's kind of a standoff. I think what's imagined is there are two sides almost equally matched in power, kind of pushing against each other, and that's what leads to the stuckness. It's like these two almost equally strong opposing forces, and I guess you can have an image of something like the trench warfare or something, where it's like these two sides are just stuck where they are and they're not really making any headway. Ultimately, eventually, one side will push down the other, and change will happen. But it's interesting that the big period of stasis in Athens, there was the one before Solon. Yeah. There was the kind of the struggle around both ends of the Pisistrated tyranny, the era of the tyrants in the 6th century. There wasn't a lot of stasis aside from the two oligarchical coups. I would say the Athenians were remarkably good at maintaining the demos on the maintaining the upper hand of the demos. So it was a period in many ways of balance, but it was balance with the demos very much holding the advantage. It's very hard for us to conceptualize that, I think.
It does. I mean, the people, yeah, it does.
So it was in some ways the Athenian experience of democracy. I think it was a period of balance and a degree of harmony, but with the kind of weight of the scale on the side of the common people, gathered together en masse, regularly meeting 4 times every 36 days, having an assembly, and every day there wasn't a festival day. The courts were in session also, and the council was in session. And they really managed to maintain I don't know, the upper hand, that they had the kind of thumb over the elite. And I mean, I think the way that I start to think about it is like a scale. I mean, it's not like a scale where the two sides are equally matched. It's a scale where the demos is thoroughly ruling over the elite, and that's what demokratia meant. On my understanding, it's the demos had kratos. Kratos is prevailing power, usually physical, or the connotation is mainly physical or military, and the ordinary people had prevailing power over their own political leaders. And this was shown both in the physical sense during the coups and the Civil War, but then later in the 4th century, it was shown in the way that they dominated the elites through the courts, in particular. So just to fill that in a little bit, they had a lot of charges that they could aim against politicians. So maybe some of the most striking ones. I mean, they had some that are very familiar to us. Like we have the idea of treason. Fine. But the Athenians also had charges for making an illegal proposal. Anyone that made a proposal that was deemed to have been illegal by any citizen, that citizen could launch a case against the politician. Equally, proposing a disadvantageous law, that was something else that politicians were personally liable for. Some of the most, striking examples from a modern perspective are some of the reasons that they had for impeachment. One famous one was making a deceitful promise to the demos. If a politician made a deceitful promise, or made a promise that even one ordinary citizen thought was deceitful, that was grounds for impeachment. And they invited impeachments every month in the assembly, in the so-called sovereign assembly, the Kyria Ecclesia. So those were some of the ways that politicians could be taken to court and disciplined by ordinary people that were kind of on an ad hoc basis. But anyone that was an office holder in Athens, so anyone who was part of the administration, essentially, these were lottery positions for the most part. Also the generals who were elected, and a few other elected positions. But anyone who was an office holder had to undergo an initial scrutiny before they took up the office. And more importantly, they had to undergo an audit at the end of the office. So at the end of the year, they had to undergo a financial and an ethical audit. Any citizen that had a complaint about their behavior in office was invited to come over a period of 3 days and lodge the complaint. And so all these politicians and office holders, they knew that was coming. They knew there was this routine mode of accountability, and I'm sure it altered the way that they behaved. So these are some of the ways that the ordinary citizens managed to maintain the upper hand over their political elite. So if you think about it, it's such a delicate balancing act, because you want people in these positions, you need them. They need to have a degree of authority and they need to have a degree of freedom. And then the puzzle is, how do you make the most of their talents? How do you use them? Incidentally, the ancient Greek word for how ordinary citizens relate to politicians is use. Krao. It's like they talked about using them as though they were kind of tools for politics. Anyway, so the Athenians wanted to be able to use the politicians for their talents, but also not let them kind of get away with anything. And the reason they could do this, and the reason it worked for them, was because the courts were staffed by ordinary people. And so this is really crucial, I think, because if the courts had been staffed by other members of the elite, if it had the kind of judicial system that we have, where we have powerful judges, very few of them who've had a certain kind of an education, certain qualifications, credentials, and who are essentially part of the kind of politico-judicial administration, it's much more difficult, I think, to actually get those kinds of prosecutions off the ground and heard and interpreted and understood from the ordinary citizen perspective. So it wasn't the case in Athens that ordinary citizens typically acted as prosecutors. It was open to them. They could if they wished. But more commonly, it was the case that rival politicians would go after one another. So, often it would be the case that a young and up-and-coming politician would be seeking to bring down their kind of older, senior figures through the courts. So there was an element of kind of divide and rule from the working class perspective, from the demotic perspective, that they kind of set in train competition among these elite politicians, a lot of rivalry, and they let them go after one another, but they nonetheless maintained the seat of judgment. They stayed in the driving seat because the judges were, in every case, these mass panels of 500 ordinary citizens. So essentially, the Athenian system, what they did was they just kind of set in train a system where ordinary citizens were constantly weighing in, or constantly given opportunities to weigh in on the qualities of their politicians and whether they supported them or not. And I think there was a real feeling in Athens of, if you put your head above the parapet as a public figure, you had to anticipate that some of your rivals would try and take you down. And you had to keep on appealing to ordinary people to essentially protect you, essentially to do you support me or not? This is the question that was posed in the courts all the time. And the result was that, virtually all politicians in Athens spent a lot of time in the courts defending themselves from different cases. There was one politician called Aristophon who boasted that he'd been indicted 75 times before the end of his life on the so-called the graphe paranomon, on the indictment against making a proposal that was illegal or kind of beyond the laws. He was indicted 75 times, but he was never convicted. So that's kind of one end of the scale. But most politicians were convicted at least once of something. Many were convicted several times. If you were convicted 3 times of having made an illegal proposal, you were stripped of citizenship. You weren't imprisoned, you weren't executed, you weren't exiled, you didn't lose any property. You did have to pay a fine usually, but you were stripped of citizenship, which just meant that you could no longer be a politician. It didn't mean that you couldn't live in Athens. It didn't mean that you couldn't own what you owned. But this was the norm for politicians in Athens, it's very. It was
the courts were political. You mentioned Absolutely. That there are 500 jurors. You didn't need unanimous decision from 500 jurors. You just needed a simple majority. So there wasn't this attempt like our own judicial system of having this veneer of impartiality.
Absolutely, yeah. So, well, let's see. It's complicated because the judges all took an oath. They all took an oath saying that they would judge in accordance with the laws and decrees of Athens, and where those laws and decrees were not kind of clear or not dispositive or kind of didn't give an obvious answer in accordance with their own sense of what was most just. This is what they all committed to. So there's an aspect of impartiality that they're looking for. They didn't think that you should just make your vote kind of untethered from the laws and decrees of the political system, that it was purely your own subjective feeling about a person. At the same time, the judges did not have to discuss their decisions with each other. There was no deliberation in the way that we think of it. They just heard the speeches on both sides of the case, and then they got their ballots and then they voted. So they really could come to whatever decision they wanted to in the privacy of their own minds. And we have there's no way of knowing why people voted one way or the other. And we also, incidentally, we don't know the results of that many cases. We know some. But so we're kind of stuck when we think about, what was influencing the judges. We have quite a lot of speeches that were given in the courts, the most famous ones. We almost never have both sides of the case. We have like 3 examples of cases where we actually have at least one speech from either side, but it's pretty rare. So we have to do a lot of guesswork, kind of what may have been influencing the judges. What was it in the speeches that really paid off? But in a very basic sense, absolutely. The courts and the judges were not expected to be neutral. They were not expected to be objective with respect to the idea of what is just or justice. They were expected to be kind of situated and partial, and to be making their decisions on the basis of what they thought was best for their political community as members of that community. And yeah, there was a simple majority vote. They kind of, in the way that we go for very small numbers and tell people to try and be objective, I think the Athenians did sort of the opposite. They went for very large numbers of people, and they tried to make it a pretty decent sample, a fairly good random sample, because they were all chosen by lottery. But I think they kind of encouraged people to just embrace their commitments, their political commitments and convictions, and to give kind of holistic judgments that took into account where they were and what their political assessments were, their political judgment. They did not ask them to kind of leave them at the door of the courtroom. Quite the opposite. They actually encouraged the judges to think about what was at stake for the community, think about their wives and their children and the kind of place they wanted to live in, think about the threats that community faced. They always had the kind of the ghosts of the 30 tyrants hovering in the background in all the 4th century speeches. It's pretty common to see references to the terrible time under the 30 tyrants when the democracy was destroyed. And no one wants to go back to that. The major threats that were represented were threats from the political elite. And so these ordinary judges were definitely encouraged to think about what the demos needed, what they as ordinary people needed, what kind of leaders they wanted, what kind of messages they were sending, what kind of examples they wanted to be, putting up for their children to look at, for example. The judicial speeches that we have really are part of the political fabric. They're part of the political world of Athens. And actually, I mean, it's really interesting. That was the norm across ancient Greece. I mean, if you look at Aristotle's rhetoric, he talks about the world of politics as being divided up into 2 questions, essentially. There's the question of what is advantageous and what is just. And the question of what is advantageous for a given community is determined in the assembly and the council if it's not a democracy. And the world of what is just, that's decided in the courts. And both of those questions are deemed to be political questions. They are questions for the polis, the political community, to think about. It's not the case that questions of advantage, in the way that we might think of them, like what is useful for the community in terms of our policies, that didn't exhaust their idea of politics. They didn't think that justice was something that was kind of siphoned off and outside politics and, in some strange way, objective. Oh, I say strange because I inhabit the ancient Greek world on this, but they didn't have any sense of it as being different from or outside politics. The one writer from the ancient world who argues very strongly that there is kind of a right answer to questions of justice that can and should be determined outside the perspective of ordinary citizens in the community, that one writer is Plato. Yeah. And from Plato, we get a sense of, he has a really urgent political agenda. I mean, in terms of, his philosophy is very, very rich and multifaceted and complex, but there's one kind of core idea that runs through many of his dialogues, and it is present in the Republic in an obvious way, and many people have read that, is this thought that to be a judge, you need to know what is just. You need to have access to a certain special kind of knowledge that most people do not have. And that is, as I read it, that is basically chipping away at the fundamental pillar of ancient Greek democracy. To the extent that the courts were crucial to the way that ordinary citizens kind of held their own over and above the political elite, and that involved totally, uneducated, unskilled people just thinking, what do I think about the situation? Do I find it to be just? Do I find it to be, does it comport with my sense of justice and my understanding of what the laws and decrees are? Plato would have done away with all that. I mean, his idea of the philosopher ruler, when he brings that in the Republic, he immediately is talking about judging. Farmers will not be judges, right? Like, it will be the philosopher rulers who do the judging in the courts. And Glaucon and Adeimantus, these interlocutors, say, yes, 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 farmers will not be judges. It seems to me that a lot of the modern idea that judicial activity is somehow separate from and outside politics, and that there's a certain special kind of knowledge that's involved in understanding what justice is, and that you need that before you can act as a judge, that is aired for the first time in the work of Plato. And in that, it always strikes me that we're living in a very Platonic time where we think that ordinary people can't act as judges, and in fact, you said we need to have special qualifications, kind of special brain power for the people who hold those positions. Because for the Athenians, it was like, you couldn't have democracy without having ordinary people acting as judges and judging their own politicians. It would have been like trying to do a boxing match with one hand tied behind your back or something. I mean, it's just you couldn't pull it off without having ordinary people decide both what was advantageous and what was just.
And this is the critique from Plato and through Plato, Socrates, and of course it is Socrates, Plato's teacher, who ends up being put to death through this political system. So you kind of understand maybe where Plato's coming from on that.
Plato was deeply traumatized by that. I mean, you know, it's clear he's got kind of PTSD. It runs through all his work. And, you know, and I understand that. It's difficult. Your mentor, you know, was tried and convicted in this kind of court. And, you know, absolutely, like many people today want to call that judicial murder. You know, that's a quote from John Donne, but lots of theorists, lots of other people, you know, they see what happened to Socrates as a savage indictment of the Athenian system. And yet, you know, it's really interesting if you look at the charges that Socrates is under. For one thing, you know, he was a public figure of a kind. He was a very influential intellectual, and that, you know, that comes with a measure of you know, I don't think it's wrong to say that people who put themselves out there as public figures, even in the private settings that Socrates was operating in, I don't think it's wrong to say they should be subject to some scrutiny, and maybe a higher degree of scrutiny than people who just stay at home on their own farms and like kind of look after their own business. The Athenians definitely thought it was fine to subject public figures to scrutiny. And, you know, the charges that were put against him, so one was kind of corrupting the youth. And interestingly, the term in Greek actually has implications of sexual implications. It has implications of kind of seduction, possibly sexual abuse. So maybe that was an aspect of the allegation that we might overlook. But the corrupting the youth was one thing, and the other was not believing in the gods that the Athenians believed in. And what's really interesting and ironic is that in the accounts that we have of Socrates's kind of defense speech in court, I mean they're not verbatim, but the accounts that we have from Plato and Xenophon of what they represent Socrates as having said in court in his self-defense, they basically have him admit openly that, yeah, he doesn't believe in the gods that the Athenians believe in. And yes, he has been corrupting the youth. He has been teaching the youth stuff that their parents wouldn't approve of. He's been telling them to question all the Athenian traditions. And of course, we mustn't forget, Socrates was the teacher of all these people in the second oligarchical coup. You know, he was deeply involved in the world of the political elite, of the anti-democrats, the Spartan sympathizers. You know, he was their teacher. Plato's uncle, his great uncle, and a cousin of his, Charmides, and Critias. Critias was the ringleader of the 30 tyrants, and he was a student of Socrates. I mean, so Socrates was embroiled in the oligarchical world, and the Athenians had these charges for, corrupting the youth and being impious, kind of not worshipping the right gods. And Socrates in his defense speech basically says, or Plato and Xenophon both have him say, yes, I have this daimon, this god that sits, a divine spirit that sits near me basically and talks to me, more or less saying I have a hotline to my own personal god. And if my god tells me that I need to act in certain ways, and you Athenians tell me I need to change my behavior, I'm going to stick with the god and not you. And this is my role. And I embrace it. And then what's very interesting about that case is that one part of the Athenian system, and it's very standard across ancient Greece, as far as I can tell from the evidence we have, they divided the vote into two. So first they had a vote on whether or not the defendant was guilty. So this was a secret ballot. Each judge had a little disc, a little metal ballot, with a rod through the middle, and it was pierced if they wanted to vote for the prosecutor, and unpierced if they were going to vote for the defendant. They dropped the ballot that they wanted to count into a bronze urn, and then the ballots were just counted up. It was quite a good, robust secret system. Once those votes were counted, it was ascertained whether or not the defendant had been found guilty. Then they would go to the vote for the penalty, and the judges were not allowed to propose their own penalty, and they were not allowed to split the difference. They had to choose either the penalty proposed by the defendant or the penalty proposed by the prosecutors. And in Socrates' case, the prosecutors proposed death. They proposed the death penalty. And Socrates thumbed his nose at the entire judicial system by proposing that he should be given free meals for life in the Protoneion, which is the best thing, it's the greatest honor that the Athenians could offer anyone, and they generally reserved it to their Olympic athletes. It was such a sarky thing to do. I mean, it's really shocking. He basically showed that he had no respect for the system whatsoever. He could have proposed the penalty of just, a fine. And ultimately he did say, okay, fine. He proposed like a very, very small fine. He could have offered something a bit bigger. And I don't have any doubt that actually the judges would have voted for his relatively small financial penalty rather than the death penalty. But when they were given the option of something really pitiful, trifling versus the death penalty, they chose death. The reason that I'm confident that actually he could have had many more people vote for him if he sort of played by the rules of the game a bit better, is that more people voted for the death penalty than originally voted for him to be convicted. So,
so something must have happened in that. I mean, you laid it out, but even a change of feelings must have occurred.
Absolutely. So the vote to convict was relatively close. There were only 35 votes in it, is the testimony that we have from Plato. And then the vote to have him be executed was much higher than that. There was a bigger difference in that. And so, it seems like he just turned the judges against him when he proposed his penalty. And they just were like, who the hell is this guy? Like, whatever. So, I don't know. So it's a complicated case. But what's fascinating, what's really amazing is that that case became so notorious and became such a damning indictment of the entire Athenian judicial system because Plato's writing about it, and Plato's writings endured. We know so much from Plato's perspective, and so we have so many reasons from his perspective to be sympathetic to Socrates and to think those Athenians, this whole system was just a nightmare. But, that is such historical happenstance. I mean, it's amazing to reflect that we actually have, as far as we know, we have everything that Plato ever wrote for publication. And that is unique among writers from the ancient world.
And it gave democracy a bad name, right? I mean,
extremely bad name. Yeah, extremely bad. And largely for this, largely on this terrain. I mean, the terrain of the people who are voting are ignorant. They don't know what's just. They don't know what's out there. They don't know what is good. They are poor. Like it's impossible for them to kind of gain in capacity or intelligence to do the kind of things that they are making decisions on. They just don't know. Instead, government should be done by those who do know, and basically the kind of lower order should be kept in their place. Then we have all of this stuff, and it's it's just a very damning picture of the Athenian system. Yeah. Interestingly, Plato's student Aristotle, it was equally anti-democratic. Didn't like the working classes being able to make these kinds of decisions. But he was actually much more open to the idea that politics is more a matter of practical judgment than it is of scientific knowledge in the way that Plato seems to portray it. And Aristotle did think that practical judgment, what we might think of as common sense, is much more widely shared, or can be much more widely shared across a community. And so there's grounds in Aristotle to kind of push back against Plato and say, look, actually, even some of the other anti-democrats around at the time didn't have his view, his very kind of exclusionary view on the basis of brain power, essentially, that most people can't take part in this stuff because they just don't know enough. So that, they lack information, they lack the right kind of intelligence. There are other anti-democrats who had, Aristotle is a really interesting case. I don't like his politics particularly, but I'm really interested in his account of kind of the human psyche and the different kinds of reasoning capacities that we have. And I feel there are resources there that we could still use to push back against Plato. Like to say that there is such a thing as common sense. Ordinary people do have ideas about justice and what is useful for their communities, what is advantageous, and you don't need what Plato calls episteme. You don't need like this particular kind of knowledge, like to do a decent job of politics. But we don't have that view. I feel like the modern view is very much a Platonic inheritance, that even people who support lots of people being enfranchised and who like kind of inclusive citizenship, they get scared when I talk about how, the Athenians did lots of things by lottery. They had ordinary people deciding on what laws to have, on what policies to have. They get a bit nervous about that. I think many people today feel, just, I don't know, a lack of confidence in ordinary people, and a feeling that like government should be done by the few, kind of for the many, hopefully with their best interests at heart, but that, at the very least, we should have a kind of meritocracy where we vote people into these positions and we give them lots of power to, yeah, to make the decisions that they feel are right. And I have now much more of a knee-jerk, a kind of Athenian democratic perspective, where I'm like, people can be great, but one lesson of Athenian politics was even the best kind of, even the fairest minded and most well-wishing politicians, they spend long enough in politics and they become sloppy. They become corrupt. You need to have these regular audits. You need to have kind of regular opportunities for them to be held accountable, just to keep them on their toes. And we're not good at that. That is something that we are really, really bad at that. We don't have the ecosystem for it. But I think it's a whole democratic ecosystem that we would need to return to.
Now, the critique about democracy in ancient Athenian democracy, and I think you get this from Plato and Aristotle, is that while it sounds good, especially in the world we live in, to have the demos have the upper hand in the political situation, what you also get is sort of this term democracy eventually devolves into mob rule. And now you have the tyranny of the majority. And my understanding is that people of Athens voted for war almost every chance they got, and supporting the expansion of empire and these kind of things.
Yeah, it's tricky. No, I wouldn't say they voted for war almost every chance they got. Let's see. I mean, the Athenian so-called empire was born at the time of the Persian invasion of Greece. So basically, the Greeks were the underdogs. The Greeks were poor, not well organized, kind of a backwater. The Persian Empire was massive, incredibly wealthy. And we get all this from Herodotus and other sources. But the decision was taken that the Persians would invade Greece, and nobody expected the Greeks to be able to fight back against them. Herodotus considers that a couple of crucial moments, it was really the Athenians and their willingness to fight that saved the whole of Hellas, kind of saved all the Greeks from the Persians. And yes, so the Battle of Marathon was one of these, and then the Battle of Salamis. Marathon was on land, kind of on the beach, and Salamis was a naval battle. Now, what's interesting is that the Athenians had put a lot of money into their navy. This is money, incidentally, that they got from the silver mines at Lavrion. They were very, very wealthy. Laurium, I guess is the earlier name, Laurion. They were very wealthy because they had these silver mines that were staffed almost entirely by slaves. So this is one of the very worst aspects of ancient Greek culture in general, but maybe specifically the Athenians. The conditions that the slaves were living in the silver mines at Laurium were just horrendous. So keeping that in mind, everything is very mixed. But they did have a lot of money because they had these silver mines, and they spent that money on the navy, and then they used that navy to defend essentially all the Greek city-states. And what was decided after the Persians were repelled was that all the allies who'd been fighting against the Persians, rather than put their own resources into their own separate defense systems, their own navies, they could, if they wished, they could keep on funding the Athenians to maintain the Athenian navy, and then the Athenians undertook to defend them in the case of any future invasion. So this was initially a system of alliances. Now, as you can imagine, the Athenians definitely had the upper hand in this situation. They were the ones with the military power. They were the ones with the money, and they started asking the allies for more and more money. And then the allies were getting more and more resentful of this, and recognized eventually, relatively quickly, they realized that they were just paying the Athenians, and they'd become the underdogs vis-a-vis the Athenians, and the Athenians now essentially had rule over them because they weren't in a position to say no when the Athenians asked them for more money. And so then the Athenians did recognize that they had what we would call an empire. They had an arche, they had rule over other communities. Their view seemed to be something like, we didn't really ask for this. It was we sort of discovered that we had it, but now that we have it, it would be foolish to give it up. I'm kind of paraphrasing a bit of Thucydides. Anyways, but so the Athenians weren't invading others. This is where I was going with this. They didn't kind of randomly declare war on other communities very much at all. It took quite a while for the Spartan war, the Peloponnesian war, the war between the Athenians and their allies, and the Peloponnesians and theirs. It took a while for that to get going. It was very long lasting. The Athenians lost. They did have another small kind of round of alliance building slash empire building in the 4th century, but they weren't a particularly aggressive people. In my estimation, they weren't very different from any other Greek city-state. I mean, they were all kind of jealous of their own territory and their own power, and of course, there was there was an element of like one-upmanship among the different communities in this area. There were loads of communities. I mean, there were maybe like 900 different city-states in a relatively small area, and there were questions about the balance of power between the bigger ones and the smaller ones and so on. But the Athenians were not, on my reading, they were not noticeably more aggressive than any other communities of that time and that place. In terms of the kind of tyranny of the majority and so on and mob rule, those are legacies of the anti-Platonic tradition, is what I would say. As early as Polybius, we get the word ochlocracy, kratos of the crowd, kratos of the mob, ruled by the mob, and I kind of want to embrace that. It was a crowd. It wasn't necessarily a mob. If we think of a mob as like a gathering that is completely informal and kind of not institutionally configured. It wasn't like that. But their assemblies were crowds of ordinary people called together. And so were their judicial panels. They were crowds of people, but that was their political system. It was organized, and they liked it that way, and they made a very good job of making it all work. It was complicated, they had these fancy allotment machines, these like lottery machines, the clevateria. They look a bit like pinball machines or like slot machines or something. But so they put some ingenuity into how they would organize all these people. It was not just, I don't know, kind of, it wasn't anything like what we'd imagine, maybe like, I don't know, lynch mobs or something. It's nothing like that. This was their system. And of course, I understand that from the elite perspective, this looks very frightening. But from the ordinary citizen perspective, it's very empowering to think that these ordinary people were called together, had an agenda for an open meeting. Every 10 days or so, they could turn up and they could help make decisions, on important issues of the day, on what they were going to do collectively. So were they going to fight some other community? Were they going to make an alliance with them? All these issues of war and peace and foreign policy, these were decided by the people who would be implicated themselves in the fighting and who would actually be carrying out these policies. So essentially what they were doing was they were asking themselves, do I want to commit to this? And also they were looking around to see, is there enough enthusiasm among the rest of us for this to actually work? Because if people don't want to do it, then it's not going to work. And that's why they devised majoritarianism, I think. That it's a very natural decision-making rule when you're among a large group of people who you would be relying on to make a success of a given course of action. You really want to know, are they up for it? Are they truly up for it or not? And so that's what they were doing, I think, when they called these assemblies. They were calling them together to kind of find out what was the general mood. Were people ready to take on this particular policy? Were they ready to try out this new law? Were they ready to put their money, their public money, into the buildings of, whatever, new temples, or how much money they were going to put into the navy? All these things, they were all as citizens already kind of implicated in those decisions. And what they needed to know was there enough popular support to make those decisions successful? And so we look at that, and I think we maybe think, oh God, just because there's more of them, the majority get to railroad the minority. I don't see that was what's happening in the ancient Greek context. I think that outvoted minorities were amazingly often very ready to go along with the majority position, very happy to go along with it, because they actually really wanted to do the thing that had the most popular support, because they recognized, especially if you're talking about fighting, especially if you're talking about going to war, they recognized that, that they would not succeed if they didn't have, if they weren't trying to pursue a policy that had actual popular support among ordinary people. So, it looks very different, I think, from the ancient Greek democratic perspective versus the Platonic perspective that we've inherited. It looks much more like majoritarianism is a way of divulging the mood of a crowd of people who are going to be asked to do something. So they're choosing their own actions. And they all wanted to do the thing that had the most support because it was most likely to actually work.
So you feel like Athenian democracy's gotten a bad knock, not just the years following after its end, but even up to today. Because oftentimes when I hear about Athenian democracy, there is an element of it. It's wide ranging, and it'll start saying, "Here's how it developed, and here is the beauty of it." But then it run amok, you know, and went crazy.
Yeah, no, I think that's all part of the bad rap. I mean, what's very interesting is that nowadays the thing that people want to attack the Athenians for most of all is that they were not sufficiently democratic because they didn't involve women, they had slaves, and they didn't. It wasn't easy to naturalize. I mean, they did have foreign residents who did become citizens, but there weren't that many. So the modern complaint is something like, it was a disaster, it ran amok, and anyway, it wasn't that democratic anyway. I mean, you know, like we want something much more universal, much more inclusive. And I feel I am completely on board with something more universal and inclusive. That's great. Bring everybody in. But some of their institutional mechanisms, and in particular the demotic control of the courts, those are techniques that we can learn from. I mean, it's very significant and illuminating to think of our system from the ancient Greek perspective. You know, they had this system, what we call representative democracy. They had that among the ancient Greeks. They had in Larissa and Abydos, we hear from Aristotle, they had a system where even the whole demos was involved in voting politicians, you know, significant individuals into positions of power on a legislative council. And those councils were often about 500 people. So it's very similar numbers to kind of modern parliaments and congresses. But then those people on the council would be the ones calling the shots. They would be the ones making decisions. But they didn't call that democratia. They called that oligarchy. It was a form of what we would call elective oligarchy. And I find it very instructive to kind of put the modern representative democracy system, aka electoral oligarchy, put that next to the Athenian and the other ancient Greek democratic systems, and think, you know, really, like, what is there in the ancient Greek world that we could not do today? You know, because I think one thing that lots of people think is something like, oh, it was so time consuming and we can't do that because we will have to work all the time now. And that's been something that people said since Benjamin Constant said it very well. But people were already saying it even before him. You know, he's like early 19th century, like 1819. Very important lecture he gave on the difference between ancient and modern liberty. So there's been this strand of, like, they were very small, a very small community. They also had slaves, so they didn't have to work. So that's why they could spend all their time doing politics. That's not the picture I see. You know, the picture I see is actually most of these people worked. They were compensated for their time when they took part in politics, and that's what enabled them to take part in politics. And it was quite a large and complex society. I mean, you know, 30,000 adult male citizens, and maybe as many as like 400,000 people altogether in Athens. It was big by ancient standards. What I think we would have to think about is how willing would we be to have open meetings as playing some role politically, just open meetings where anybody could go and where those meetings were actually empowered to make decisions. And how comfortable we are with the idea of ordinary citizens acting as judges. Because that, I think, is the point where a lot of modern Democrats just feel like, oh my God, like that sounds like a nightmare. And I feel like I understand kind of where that view is coming from, but I also feel that we've had this trick played on us when it comes to Athenian democracy. Like, we've been told so many things about it, how it was a nightmare and didn't work and whatever. And it's really, a lot of it is anti-democratic propaganda from very obvious sources, and people recognize, you know, when they look at the sources, they realize it's anti-democratic propaganda. But yeah, I feel we should try a bit harder to see past that.
Yeah, I feel like the way we say democratic today has changed. I've always said democracies have always limited who can and who cannot participate in their system.
Yes. I mean, you're thinking of the women and the slaves, and so being so yes. I mean, sure. One interesting thing is that demos didn't imply everybody that lives in a given territory, to the ancient Greeks. It specifically implied the ordinary people gathered together in an assembly. So then there's a whole separate question, which is who is a citizen, who is eligible to attend the assembly. But the idea that really what it involves is the prevailing power of a mass. People who, again, as I kind of said earlier, the people who are not significant unless they're part of a mass, versus the people who are significant as individuals, you know, that mass can be open to everybody. I mean, there's nothing to stop us just saying, sure, most people are undistinguished and indistinguishable. Most of us are not significant individually. You know, we're the 99%. Like, very, very few people have a major public platform. And yeah, that group could be as large as we want it to be. There's no reason why we can't just say everybody can come to an assembly. There's nothing difficult about that. We even have, you know, stadia all over the place. We have places where we can gather in very large numbers. We could probably think about ways of doing things virtually, although I do think that physically gathering together gives a very strong sign of popular power, and a measure of intimidation that's healthy for politicians to be subject to. When you look out and see a huge crowd of people, many of whom don't support you, that is a very interesting position for an elite politician to find themselves in. And that's actually worth reiterating, because in the ancient world, it was never the case you would have crowds and crowds of people who were all politically of the same stripe. They were mixed crowds politically. They would not be gathered together just to support one politician. They were gathered together to make decisions with a range of politicians speaking on either side of the question. So it wasn't like these mobs where you can think of, oh, everybody who's there supports this one guy, and isn't that scary? Instead, it was, yeah, there'd be some people that supported you and some people that didn't support you. And that also meant that ordinary citizens had to kind of rub shoulders with people whose views they didn't share. They had to share public space with people who were very different from them politically. But nonetheless, they had to grapple with the reality of them, and their right to be there, their right to have their view heard just the same as their own view is heard. I feel that's a very healthy thing for democracy as well.
Daniela Cammack has been our guest. Again, Daniela Cammack, assistant professor at UC Berkeley. Her research and teaching focuses on the history of democracy and constitutionalism. She is currently working on a book that I hope she'll come back to talk to us about when it comes out, about Greek democracy. Daniela Cammack, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the invitation. Thank you so much.